All right, here we are. Hi, Kevin. Thanks again for being here. Really appreciate it. I think there's probably nobody who is more suitable for teaching myself and the people watching now about heads up and giving their point of view. So thanks again for coming.
Appreciate it. I'm looking forward to it. Thanks, Pets.
No problem. So what's your kind of experience in terms of heads up sit and goes? Because I think you're more renowned for kind of, deep stack, crushing people like high stakes, winning the run it once challenge. What's your kind of experience at like shallower stack sizes?
Yeah, a lot of that has been sort of since I transitioned to tournaments. Like I've been playing tournaments a lot for the last couple of years. But I mean, if we go way back, like 10, 12 years ago, I was pretty involved in the Heads Up Sit and Go community. I did some training with the Heads Up Sit and Go site. So I kind of understood the short stack mechanics from that. But I mean, fast forward to today and, it's the solver era. We've got a lot more detailed information. So to be honest, like I've had to learn a lot of this stuff from scratch, 40 big blinds and under. And then I find that, 60 big blinds and above is very much in my wheelhouse. The rare situations where you do get, a nice deep stack heads up at the end of a tournament, I feel really comfortable because I have played about a decade's worth of heads up no limit cash, which I'm very studied at, and I've played against a lot of the best players, at least from 2015 to 2018 probably, and like you mentioned, the Legend Showdown with Run It Once in 2020. So pretty in tune with how that works at like a high level, and the shallower stuff. It's pretty much like me versus whatever tournament players I've been running into lately, and trying to learn from the solvers.
Interesting, yeah. So it's kind of interesting when I play heads up. I often, if I feel like I have an edge, you can kind of feel your edge, but you don't necessarily know like how big your edge is. So like if I'm playing say 50 big blinds deep, I don't know. Do I have like a 1% edge? Do I have a 5% edge? How do you kind of you obviously have more experience there? How do you know, or how do you kind of estimate your ROI in kind of heads up matches? Because heads up pay jumps are obviously really big, especially if you're in a W coop or scoop. So having a big stable previously, I never really knew what to advise to my guys once they got to heads up because they had an edge against their opponent a lot of the time. At least I assume so, but I wasn't necessarily sure of how big that edge was. I think that's probably the first question a lot of people will have is like, should I even play heads up? Like, should I deal kind of thing? What's your kind of stance on this kind of thing?
Right. Yeah, that is tough to calculate. I mean, it's very dependent on the structure of the tournament, right? So if you're getting to a final table with an average stack of 15 big blinds, and by the time you get to heads up, you're maybe playing 20 blinds deep, it's going to be really hard to generate a big edge on even a recreational opponent in that situation. But you can always look to like heads up sit and goes or spins and kind of look at like the ROIs of the best players in those formats because there is going to be some crossover in terms of the structure. So I think it's fair to say that it's going to be hard to generate more than a 5% edge in like a very shallow heads up environment. But if you're looking at like a 50 big blind stack, a 75 big blind stack, which comes up now and then on certain tournament final tables, those are situations where you could easily have above a 60% win rate in those situations. So that's a huge ROI, right? So I think it's very much worth working hard on the. I mean, you kind of have to learn all the stack depths because even if you start at 50 big blinds, you're eventually going to get down to 15. But I think it's very much worth like learning if you can generate, a 10% edge in those deeper stack heads up scenarios and a 5% edge in the shallower ones. Like you said, they're huge pay jumps. You're talking about thousands of dollars in edge in one match.
Yeah, the way that I kind of looked at it previously, and I still do look at it, which this could be very flawed, so please educate me if so, is that if I get to let's say I have the same stack as my opponent and the pay jump is say 50k, so that let's say second is like 80k and first place is like 130,
Yeah,
then the way that I kind of approach it is if this guy was sitting in a heads up lobby with a 60 big blind heads up match for $50,000 or $25,000, would I sit against him? And
right.
if the answer is no, then I usually think it's like my ego telling me to play rather than the maths or rather than the edge. Is this and this is what I've always told my opponents or my students, sorry, that even if you play like say $100 MTT in first place is 10k, if the page up is only 2k, would you really sit this guy to 2k heads up sit and go? Like would you be confident enough to do that with the rig, etc.? That's kind of how I approach it. Would you say this is flawed or does it have some merits, you think?
I think that's the right approach when you're talking about like risk management, right? So if we're talking about whether or not you should deal or whether or not you should sell action heads up or whatever it is, like playing for X% of the prize pool at the end, that's exactly how you should be thinking about it. But what I would, at least personally, because I have a heads up background, when I play tournaments, I'm like, I'm maybe taking my risk management at the final table when there's 9 players left or 6 players left, so that by the time we get to heads up, I'm playing for exactly what I want to play for, because that part of the tournament for me is probably the highest edge situation that I'm going to run into, especially if I'm at a tough final table full of good players, right? So for me, the riskier part is like when we're six-handed. But if I'm lucky enough to get heads up, I kind of want to be playing for 5 figures or 6 figures, because that's a situation where if I can get a 5 or 10% edge, I'm creating you know multiple buy-ins worth of profit in one heads up sit and go. But you do need to. I completely agree with the mentality that like you need to set kind of your tolerance for how big of a buy-in of a heads-up match are you willing to play against this person. Because even if you have a 5% edge, you can go on a 50 buy-in downswing and heads-up sit and goes. I mean, are you ready to go on a 50 buy-in downswing for 25K heads-up matches?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and probably something which I know it's not heads up, but I think a lot of people probably start assessing their risk once they get to heads up, rather than selling action off when they get. I know you can do this now on GG, like sell some action on like day threes of tournaments, but typically I
Yeah, and it's
think
not always an option.
yeah, I think once in my life I've sold more action once I've got to a final table where I should have probably done it a lot of times.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, so I think that's firstly a really good point, and allowing yourself to have that bigger piece once you get to the heads up makes a lot of sense. I think that's really smart. I think that's especially if you do feel like you're going to have an edge on a lot of players, because I think another thing is that against regs, when you're playing six-handed, eight-handed, of course, there's going to be edge to realize. But I think heads up really is where a lot of edge comes from.
Yeah.
A lot of the calls which I speak about elsewhere is that when we're playing very wide ranges, like let's say we're playing cutoff against button or we're playing EP against button, we often make a lot more money cutoff against button because the button's range becomes a lot wider against the cutoff, and people really struggle to call with the kind of worse hands that they should call with. So they really struggle
Mm-hmm.
to play these like medium strength hands. So like if the board is, let's say, 6-4-2, they may struggle to continue if they're king eight suited without a backdoor flush draw, which they have to defend versus your bet, this kind of thing. And I
Yeah.
think in heads up, it's kind of the same story where even really, really top MTT pros who are used to playing like an average VPIP of, say, 28%, they're going to really struggle once it goes into the 80% because they're just not going to be familiar with playing so much of the time. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I think yeah, that's kind of
I,
how I see it.
I've spoken about how like my transition was to tournaments, and I felt that coming from a heads up background, like by far the biggest edge that I was able to realize immediately was just playing out of the big blind in wide range situations. So it's exactly like what you're talking about, either playing out of the big blind or playing against the big blind, right? So all the really wide range situations, you become really comfortable, you become, kind of sharp at picking out where people will struggle to defend, and once you've identified all those spots, you know exactly where your edge is, and you it's kind of a print. Like that type of edge is a print, right? It's not the type of edge where you're feeling out like, ooh, I think he bluffs a little bit too much in this big pot, maybe I'll call a little bit too much or something. It's just, oh, he's not going to be able to defend here, let's bluff everything.
And it's a relatively low variance print as well, right? It's something which
Yeah.
you're not like risking your tournament life on, where one of these big calls like you spoke about is going to be the kind of situation where you're trying to make the hero call for all the chips kind of thing, which is very going to be a lot of high variance, rather than just putting yourself in the position of repeated edge over and over again, which I guess is what heads up is going to be about a lot of the time, right? Just having
Yeah.
that edge a lot of the time. Yeah, okay. I think this has been good. Let's move on to some preflops. So, how have you previously kind of approached preflop when you've been thinking about shallower stack sizes? How did you said before solvers you were just trying to work it out yourself? So I'm interested of where like your logic came from and what you kind of worked out without seeing all the solvers, just with kind of pen and paper kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was definitely how I started. I think the key thing that you learn in heads up sit and goes, or just from like getting familiar with shallower stacks, is kind of the mechanic of like at what point does my opponent get to increase their rejamming frequency or their jamming frequency against whatever decision it is that I'm taking. So for example, like in 100 big blind cash games, you basically can play raise or fold from the button and not worry too much, because if your opponent three bets aggressively, you still have like maneuverability. You still have options to call and four bet and whatever. Um, get down to 50 big blinds, and uh, you start to get into a situation where three betting more aggressively and continuing against four bets starts to become easier. And from the out of position player's point of view, there's kind of a threshold where three betting all in starts to become good, or maybe from the point of view of the big blind, there's a threshold where four betting all in starts to become comfortable and high frequency. So kind of learning where those like points were in the stack depth hierarchy, so to speak, it was like a big part for me, was kind of learning like, okay, at this stack depth, it makes sense to limp a lot on the button because I don't want to get three bet jammed efficiently. At this stack depth, it makes sense to three bet, non all in with a polar range because I don't want to get four bet all in efficiently. And those adjustments were the key, I think, like construction of how everything came together. Where I would try and draw a line and say like, okay, I can be linear here, I can be polar there. I understand what my plan is against the next bet, essentially.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. So people would have been learning at different speeds to you. So, people would have been, there'll be some people who would have been ahead of you in terms of learning about or just picking up some stuff, but most people would have been behind you. What did you feel like was the biggest kind of exploits before kind of Monka, before kind of PO came out? What did you kind of think where you could really realize a lot of edge where your opponents were kind of behind? Because I believe probably like if that's the heads up sit and go community, probably that's where the MTT community kind of is right now in terms of heads up. That's what I would assume, at least somewhat similar flaws in their logic.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, to be fair, like a lot of the period of time you're talking about, I was pretty focused on heads up cash, but I think I can speak to kind of both formats where pre solver, the way that you created ranges was very like was very human in nature, right? It was these are my bluffs, these are my value hands. I'm going to try and get the right frequency of value versus bluff, and as the player facing aggression, I'm going to try to call down approximately as often as I need to make bluffing a bad idea, and that all kind of fit things neatly into boxes, but it didn't quite capture the complexity of like preflop preflop strategies with regards to like not all in three betting or not all in four betting, or like choosing the right hand class so that you don't fold too much equity. I think that's where like solvers kind of advance the game a lot. So before, we weren't really thinking about how much equity am I folding away. We were kind of just very neatly saying like, I'm going to barrel when it's good to barrel. I'm going to three bet when it's good to three bet. I'm going to raise when it's good to raise, right? So that's kind of where edges are being found today. I think is not just being aggressive, but being aggressive with the right hands. Not just bluff catching, but bluff catching with the right hands, and making sure that your overall strategy is not like losing EV in random places because you're being sloppy. Um, but I guess to answer your question about where the edge was previously, I think it was really just in like being aggressive, and that holds true kind of through the years. It's just maybe ramped up, right? Like everyone knows how to be aggressive when c betting, but do they know how to be aggressive when delay c betting? A lot of people know how to be aggressive when check raising flop, but do they know how often to barrel the turn? Like there's just a bit of complexity there that the less seasoned player is not going to have like quite the right levels.
Yeah, for sure. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, even talking about the Doug Polk versus Negreanu challenge, I think for even some like top players in the world, they may really be surprised about some of the showdowns a lot of the time. Like I know
Yeah,
personally that when I'm watching it, one of my friends is Jason Mack. You may have played against him. He plays he's been
yeah,
playing a lot of 25-50 and 50-100 heads up against CPS and those guys recently, kind of battling the highest guys. I think a little bit against Meg Boyfin as well. And I see some showdowns and I'm like, I know that they're following charts. I know it must be right, but I'm like, why are they free betting Queen Nine offsuit? Why are they free betting Jack Nine offsuit? There's a lot of things which is kind of just it doesn't really seem like productive, or it doesn't seem
yeah,
logical to like the MTT mind because usually you free bet Jack Nine, it's like well he's always going to fold Jack Eight or like not always, but he's going to fold the Jack Sevens, the Jack Sixes, and he's never going to fold Jack 10. So we're not really getting something out of our hand. I think a lot of MTT always comes from logic, so we always want to kind of achieve something, with our ranges
yeah,
because at 30, 40, 50 big blinds, you always are trying to achieve something usually, whether you're
Yep.
trying to get portions of the range to fold, portion of the ranges to continue. Like King Seven suited is a good example, right? King Seven suited is often seen as an aggressive free bet because we can make King Eight, King Nine fold, King Ten fold in MTTs. We block pocket sevens, we block ace king, and we have okay equity when called. Like it's king seven suited. So that I can make sense of, right, from an MTT point of view. But kind of these deep stack, no limit heads up stuff, I've really struggled with because I just don't really see. I can't. My mind just can't accept it. It just can't accept why we're free betting these hands.
Yep.
So I think that's what a lot of people have kind of struggled with. I think there's been a lot of eyes on this challenge, and some of the showdowns, even from the commentators who are watching, who are like, seasoned high stakes MTT pros or whoever, cash game pros for however many years, they've often been surprised with the kind of showdowns which have been there. So what do you think about these kind of unnatural combos in GTO, which we're probably not going to see in these MTT formats because people aren't going to really be able to understand and put them into practice, kind of thing?
Yeah. I think, I mean, so I know where those combos come from, and a lot of it is basically just players trying to take solver output and play more accurately to them. Uh, but I don't necessarily think that there's like some magic properties that make these hands better when they're deeper or worse than they're shallower. I think that there's just a certain, the things that I usually emphasize in terms of like pre-flop range construction is frequency and ratios, right? So having the right frequency of three betting is important because it challenges your opponent's button strategy, their RFI strategy, to be in line, right? To not RFI too much or too little. Um, and then three betting the right ratio means, when I get four bet, I have my calls and my folds at roughly the right frequency. The other stuff isn't really that important in terms of like your bottom line. Maybe you're mixing the combos so that you have good board coverage. Maybe you're mixing the combos so that against certain calling hands you just have more equity post flop. So you're not taking pure trash in three betting and pure nut hands in three betting because you just don't have enough equity post flop in some scenarios. Maybe there's some stuff going on there that's important to think about. But does it make up for a better range that's going to generate a lot more EV? No, I don't really think so.
Okay, that's good. That's good to know. Yeah, because I think a lot of people, this match, I think, has been probably one of the biggest things which has happened in history of poker, probably. And I think it's people from all kind of different game types are kind of watching and being like, "Wow, Heads Up is a fucked up game." Do you know what I mean? It's been like, "Wow,
Yeah.
there's some fucked up stuff happening here." I think. So that's been good
Yeah.
to note, and I think it also, from like an intellectual point of view, it also challenges yourself to kind of think of the game in certain ways and to start to understand, especially wider ranges. I think Heads Up is so beautiful, I think, in the way that you play such a wide range and you have to play almost every hand. I kind
Yep.
of, we're going to go into it very shortly, but I kind of reach to play 100% VPIP almost always, at least, 50 and under big blinds because of how I believe the response is against limp from deeper stack sizes. And then when we're shallower, just that we get to limp a lot of the top of our range, so we can just limp a lot essentially.
Yep.
So yeah, I think it is really a good game, and it's good to have you here to guide us through it because I wouldn't be 100% comfortable to say exactly everything about the mechanics of this.